Hello everyone! For this episode, we are going to tackle about the basic concepts of literature. So here are our objectives. First, define the general types of literature and the literary genres. Second, give examples for each literary genre. And lastly, identify the figures of speech in the rhetorical devices which are necessary in understanding literary works. Let's define first what is literature. It refers to writings having excellence of form or expression and presenting ideas of permanent or universal interest. It is the body of written works produced in a particular language, country, or age on a particular subject. So we have two types of literature. We have the prose and the poetry. So let's discuss this one by one. So what is prose? It is a literary medium distinguished from poetry, especially by its greater irregularity and variety of rhythm. It is closer correspondence to the patterns of everyday speech. It differs from poetry in terms of tone, pace, and object of attention. For short, prose has no pattern. So there are types of prose. We have the essay, fiction, prose drama, and non-fiction prose. So first, let's discuss about essay. It is an analytic, interpretive, or literary composition, usually much shorter and less systematic and formal than a dissertation or thesis, and usually dealing with its subject from a limited and often personal point of view. It began at the beginning of the 17th century, where the themes focused on the cultivation of social manners. So we have different types of essay. We have the reflective, descriptive, didactic, periodical, and critical. Another type of prose is the fiction. So fiction is a literature created from the imagination, not presented as fact. It may be based on a true story or situation. And we have different kinds of fiction. We have the fables, myths, and legends. So first, let's talk about fable. So fable is a short allegorical tale conveying a moral or principle of behavior. The characters are usually animals talking like human beings but keeping their animal traits. Example of fable is the hare and the tortoise, or mas kilala sa atin na ang kuneho at ang pagong. Next is the myth. It is a traditional tale common to the members of a tribe, race, or nation. It is usually involves the supernatural and serves to explain natural phenomena or suggest a religious or moral truth. So, example naman ng myth ay yung The Creation. So, ang The Creation, mayroon tayong iba't ibang version. Mayroong Bisaya version, Tagalog version, Manobo version. So, yun ay tinatawag natin na myth. Another is we have the legend. It is a story of some wonderful events popularly believed to have some historical basis and passed down through the ages. Some qualities are partly real and partly mythical. Example of legend is the legend of Sigbin ng mga Hiligaynon. Next is the fairy tale. It is a simple narrative dealing with supernatural beings, such as fairies, magicians, ogres, or dragons, that is typically of folk origin and written or told for the amusement of children. It contains improbable events, scenes, and personages, often having a whimsical, satirical, or moralistic character. Example of fairy tale is the Frog Princess. Next is the folk tale. It is characteristically anonymous, timeless, and placeless tale, circulated orally among people. It is hardly distinguished from myths since, especially in tales of tricksters and heroes, they presuppose a background of belief about tribal origins in the relations of morals and gods. Example is the How Pilandok Became a Sultan or Naging Sultan si Pilandok. Next is prose satire. These are stories in which human vices and follies are held up to ridicule. Among the standard characters are the jealous, stupid husband, the braggart, and the unfaithful wife. So example nito is the Decameron of Giovanni Boccaccio. Next is the novel. Novel is a prose narrative in a large scale or book length. It can be fantasy, love, and adventure novel. Example is the Woman Who Had Two Navels by Nick Joaquin. And another, we have the short story. It is a prose narrative of limited length which must have characterization, unity, cumulative interest, climax, and resolution. It is usually concerned with a single effect conveyed in a single significant episode or scene, and involving a limited number of characters, sometimes only one. And example is The Dead Stars by Paz Marquez Benitez. And lastly is the Novelette. Novelette is a prose narrative that is intermediate between the short story and the novel. It is about 50 to 150 pages long, more elaborate than a short story, but can be read in a single setting. And example is The Birthing of Hannibal Valdez by Romulo Sandoval. Another types of prose is the prose drama. It is a literary work written in dialogue and intended for presentation by actors. Its essence is the make-believe by which an actor impersonates a character of the play. Example is the Walang Sugat ni Severino Reyes. Under prose drama is the comedy. It is a type of drama which aims primarily to amuse and which ends happily. It may be satirical in manner that ridicules social follies. Example of this is the A Midsummer Night's Dream. Next is tragedy. It is a drama where the chief character undergoes a morally significant struggle which ends disastrously. It assumes that humanity has a sense of its own dignity and free will, a sense of a moral law and forces which lie outside of and are bigger than an individual. And the example is the Oedipus the King by Sophocles. And next is the Farce. It is an exaggerated comedy based broadly on humorous situations. It is generally regarded as intellectually and aesthetically inferior to comedy in its crude characterizations and implausible plots. Example is the Importance of Being Earnest by Oscar Wilde. Next is the history play. It is a play with a theme from history, consisting usually of loosely connected episodes chronologically arranged. Also known as the chronicle play, it often emphasizes the public welfare by pointing to the past as a lesson for the present. An example of this is the Edward II by Christopher Marlowe. And lastly, under the prose drama is the melodrama. It is a play with sensational actions, sentimental love story, extravagant emotions, and generally a happy ending. The virtuous suffers in the hands of the villainous, but in the end, virtue is triumphant. The example of this is Under the Gaslight by Augustine Dallis. Next is non-fiction. It is the literary works that are based mainly on fact rather than on the imagination. They may contain fictional elements. So let's discuss the different types of nonfiction. First, we have the biography. It is a literary type where the subject is the life of an individual. This form includes autobiography, in which the author recounts his or her own history. The example of this is the Lives of English Poets by Samuel Johnson. Next is the letter. It is a personal written message to another person, and also called epistolary literature, whose popularity as a genre has continued to the present day. Example of this is the Urbana at Pilisa by Modesto de Castro. Another, we have the diary. It is a record of events, transactions, or observations kept daily or at frequent intervals. Written primarily for the writer's use alone, it usually offers a frankness not found in writing done for publication. So in the diary, we can write all the things that we want to. So this is for our own consumption. And all our secrets can be written on the diary. Next is the journal. It is an account of a day-to-day events or a record of experiences, ideas, or reflections kept regularly for private use, similar to but less personal than a diary. The word is often used of official or semi-official publications of special groups. Example of this is the Journal to Stella by Jonathan Swift. And lastly, under the nonfiction is the literary criticism. It is a discipline concerned with a range of inquiries about literature. It may be philosophical, descriptive, or evaluative. Next topic is the poetry. It is a writing that formulates a concentrated imaginative awareness of language, of experience in language chosen, and arranged to create a specific emotional response through its meaning, sound, and rhythm. It can be distinguished from prose in terms of form by its compression, frequent employment of the conventions of meter and rhyme, but its reliance upon the line as a formal unit, heightened vocabulary, and a freedom of syntax. So for short, poetry has rhythm, rhyme, and number. So yun yung pagkakaiba nila ng prose at saka poetry. Kasi ang prose, it has no pattern, whereas ang poetry, it has rhythm, rhyme, and number. So there are three types of poetry. We have the narrative, lyric, and dramatic poetry. First, let's discuss the narrative poetry. It tells a story in richly imaginative and rhythmical language. It is the product of the oral tradition. We have different types of narrative poetry. It includes epic, mythical romance, ballad, and mythical tale. So, let's discuss the epic. It is a long narrative poem in an elevated style that celebrates heroic achievement. It treats themes of historical, national, religious, or legendary significance. Example of this is the Bantugan or Prinsipi Bantugan ng mga Maranao. Next is mythical romance. It is a long rambling love story in verse. It dominantly depicts ideals of chivalry, romantic love, and religious elements. An example of this is the Florante at Laura by Francisco Baltazar. Next is ballad. It is a short narrative poem intended to be sung. Types can be either folk or literary, as in the epic. Example of this is the Ballad of a Mother's Heart by Jose Lavilla Chera. Next is the mythical tale. It deals with any emotion or phase of life, and its story is told in a simple, straightforward, and realistic manner. It is comparable to a short story, but short story is in prose while mythical tale is in verse. And example is the Bayani ng Bukid by Al Perez. And next type of poetry is the lyric poetry. So it is a verse that expresses intense personal emotion. It expresses the thoughts and feelings of the poet, and it's sometimes contrasted with narrative poetry and verse drama. And we have types of lyric poetry: the ode, elegy, song, and sonnet. First is the ode. It is rather extended poem, is usually complicated in meter and stanza forms, and always deals with a serious theme such as immortality. It is considered the most majestic lyric type that expresses enthusiasm, lofty praise of some person or thing. Example of this is the Ode to a Nightingale by John Keats. Next is the elegy. It is a poem of a subjective and meditative nature. It can be distinguished by its subject, that is, that. Example of this is the Break, Break, Break by Alfred Lord Tennyson. Next is the song. It is a short lyric poem intended to be sung. It has that particularly melodious quality required by a singing voice. And we have two types of song: the secular or non-religious, and the sacred or religious songs. Next is the sonnet. It is a lyric poem distinguished by its exact form of 14 iambic pentameter lines. The lines are arranged in two waves of thought, the rising in the octave and the falling in the sestet. Example of this is the Sonnet 1 of William Shakespeare. So make sure basta sonnet talaga, mayroon lang siyang 14 lines. Next is dramatic poetry. It portrays life and character through action and powerful emotion-packed lines such as those in Shakespeare's plays. The poetic form is used to set forth life and character by means of speech and action. And under the dramatic poetry, we have also comedy, tragedy, farce, historical play, and melodrama. Next is the dramatic monologue. It is a poem written in the form of a speech of an individual character to an imaginary audience. Quote, at a dramatic moment or crisis in his life, the speaker unconsciously, even ironically, reveals his innermost character. Example of these are My Last Duchess by Robert Browning and The River Merchant's Wife, a Letter by Ezra Pound. Next is the figures of speech. It is a form of expression used to convey meaning or heighten effect, often by comparing or identifying one thing with another that has a meaning or connotation familiar to the reader or listener. So we have different kinds of figures of speech. First, we have semili. It is a comparison between two unlike entities. The resemblance is explicitly indicated by the words like or as. Example, oh, my love is like a red, red rose. Okay, next is the metaphor. It is a word or phrase denoting one kind of object or action is used in place of another to suggest a likeness or analogy between them. It is an implied comparison in contrast to the explicit comparison of the semili. Example, the ship plows the sea. Next is the personification. Human characteristics are attributed to an abstract quality, animal, or inanimate object. It makes things or ideas seem vital and alive, as if they were human. Example, how sweet the moonlight sleeps upon the bank. Next is hyperbole. It is an intentional exaggeration for emphasis or comic effect. It is common in love poetry in which it is used to convey the lover's intense admiration for the beloved. Example, she cried a river of tears. Another example, I've looked all over the world for this pen. Next is the senec. It is a part represents the whole, or less commonly, the whole represents the part. Closely related to metonymy, it is an important poetic device for creating imagery. For example, the western wave was all aflame. So ang wave substitutes for the sea. Another example is yung "Can I borrow your wheels?" So yung wheels doon, nagre-represent siya ng car. So ganun yung gamit ng senec. So yung isang part ay magre-represent ng kabuuan, or yung kabuuan ay magre-represent ng parts. Okay? So next is the metonymy. It consists of using the name of one thing for something else for which it is associated. Its use enables the writer to replace generalities and abstractions with concrete and vivid images. For example, land belongs to the crown should be respected. So yung crown doon, nagre-represent siya ng king or queen. So yun yung tinatawag natin na metonymy. Next is antonomasia. It is some defining word or phrase is substituted for a person's proper noun. The practice to a giving of character a proper name that defines or suggests a leading quality of that character. Like for example, Squire Allworthy, ito yung tawag sa mga taong nagbibigay ng mga good advices. Dr. Sobons naman for slang ng physician. And for Shakespeare, tinatawag siyang the Bard of Avon. Or, for example, si Alexander the Great. So, yun yung antonomasia na tinatawag. Next is litotes. Conscious understatement is used to create emphasis by negation. Literally, plainness, a derivative of litos, plain or simple. Example, not bad, no mean fit. Next is irony, the use of words to express something other than and especially the opposite of the literal meaning. Some use expressions of praise where blame is meant, feigning ignorance and humility. Like for example, you are so beautiful, you look like a Christmas tree. Next is allusion. It is implied or indirect reference to a person, event, thing, or a part of another text. Uses literary, biblical, socio-political, scientific, mythological event or character. Like for example, Matt is my Waterloo. Next basic concept of literature is the rhetorical devices. It is concerned with the art of speaking or writing formally and effectively, especially as a way to persuade or influence people. First is the oxymoron. It is a word or group of words that is self-contradicting. It is similar to such other devices as paradox and antithesis. It is often used in poetry or other literature. Like for example, bittersweet, plastic glass, and ice water. So yun yung example ng oxymoron. Next is the paradox. It is apparently self-contradictory statement, the underlying meaning of which can only be revealed through careful scrutiny. Its purpose is to arrest attention and provoke fresh thought. Like for example, less is more. And another example is, all animals are equal but some animals are more equal than others. So yun yung example ng paradox. Another is the antithesis. It is irreconcilable opposites or strongly contrasting ideas are placed in sharp juxtaposition and sustained tension. The opposing clauses, phrases, or sentences are often roughly equal in length and balance in parallel grammatical structures. Like for example, they promised freedom and provided slavery. Next is the apostrophe. It is a speaker turns from the audience as a whole to address a single person or thing. An address to a dead person as though he were alive. An absent person as though he were present. An inanimate object as though he were animate. Like for example, death, be not proud. And, O Rizal, rise and save the youth. So those are the example of apostrophe. Next is assonance. It is relatively close juxtaposition of similar sounds, especially of vowels, and also called vowel rhyme. Like for example, quite right, free as a breeze, high as a kite. Next is the alliteration. It is the repetition of consonant sounds in two or more neighboring words or syllables. The initial consonant sounds are the same, thus the alternate name head rhyme. Like for example, pretty as a picture, dead as a doornail. Another example is, while I thundered, weak and weary. And lastly is the onomatopoeia. It is the naming of a thing or action by a vocal imitation of the sound associated with it. The use of words whose sound suggests the sense. Like for example, the pitter-patter of the raindrops on the roof, and hear the bells, how they tinkle, tinkle, tinkle. So those are the basic concepts of literature. So I'm your teacher May, leaving this message of Northrop Frye. Literature speaks the language of the imagination, and the study of literature is supposed to train and improve the imagination. Thank you so much!